Hi, my name is Lydia. Welcome to my channel. If you are interested in true crime, I hope you stick around. A special thank you and a hello to my returning subscribers. I am so happy to have you here. So, as you can see, my face is not on today's video. I tried a different audio setup when I recorded today's true crime story, and I wasn't able to get the new mic to work with my camera. And truth be told, I didn't really like that audio setup, so I'll be back to using my normal mic in my next video. And I'll be back on camera for that video too. I'm always trying to improve my quality of these videos a little bit at a time, and I appreciate your patience with me. So this story will be told via photos and a voiceover, and at the end of the video I will include some news footage, and I will also throw in a video of my cats for my cat-loving subscribers. This case brings us to the state of Indiana, and like my last video, it's another rage-inducing story. It involves the death of children, and that's always a great big punch to the gut. In fact, it also involves the topic of suicide, so if that's a sensitive subject for you, I will see you in my next video. Thanks everyone for sticking around, I appreciate it. Let's begin. In 2000, Judy Kirby was a 31-year-old mother of 8 biological children, though from the information I gathered online, she had 11 children in total in her custody at the time of this story. Out of those 11 children, one was a nephew that she had adopted. Judy's youngest child at the time of this crime was around 5 months old. And to have 8 kids by the age of 31 is sort of shocking when you consider it. For the last 10 to 12 years of her life prior to this crime, she must have been pregnant more days than she wasn't. Judy was born in 1968. And I don't know a lot about her life leading up to this crime, which is just as well because she doesn't deserve the time of day, as you will see by the end of this video. However, I do know that at the time, Judy had been divorced from her ex-husband, Victor Kirby, for about 6 years, and that she was currently in a relationship with her ex-husband's brother, Tinny Kirby. Scandalous, I know. Judy and Tinny's relationship had recently begun to sour, and those relationship problems seem to have contributed to the events which take place in this story. In Judy's trial, witnesses would state that she had recently discovered that Tinny had been cheating on her. Judy had more than just relationship problems with Tinny, however. She had been locked in a custody dispute with his brother, her ex-husband, ever since their divorce, and she was constantly worried that she would lose custody of the children that they had together. From the information I gathered online, it also seems that Judy was a prescription painkiller addict. Later testimony in her trial would reveal that she had been taking Dilaudid, which is a prescription form of morphine, for years and years. And she drank alcohol as well, and as we all know, booze and painkillers don't mix very well at all. Judy was also being investigated by local police for possible drug dealing or drug trafficking. I can assume that the drugs in questions may have been related to her painkiller addiction problem, so she had been officially under surveillance for about 7 months, leading up to the crime that we're going to talk about in this video. I don't know the details of that investigation since that drug case was never resolved, at least on Judy's end, and she was never charged for that particular crime. But because of that investigation, Judy was always paranoid about being surveilled. Testimony in Judy's trial would reveal that she was paranoid to the point that she was convinced the Secret Service was tunneling under her house to spy on her. Witnesses presented photos of holes she had ripped into the walls of her house, searching for surveillance devices. And witnesses would also report that Judy had taken to wearing disguises and placing cameras in trees. She would tell family and friends that she was always being watched and followed. In addition to her paranoia about the surveillance, Judy was also suffering from postpartum depression, or at least at the time of her trial, that's what she had claimed was happening. Her youngest child was around 5 months old, so it's a little rare that she would still be suffering from that form of depression that late after childbirth, but of course it is possible. So for all of these reasons, and likely more that I just don't know about, basically Judy Kirby was spiraling. And her friends and family noticed it. They were concerned enough to tell Judy that she needed to get professional help, and Judy was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric unit at the local hospital on March 2nd, 2000. That would end up only being 23 days before the tragic events which would take place later that month. The reason for her involuntary commitment was labeled as postpartum depression and some sort of mental instability, which was presenting with bizarre behavior. At the hospital, Judy was diagnosed with psychosis and given risperidol, an antipsychotic drug. However, only 2 days later, on March 4th, Judy checked herself out of the hospital. It was against the medical advice of her doctors, but she was no longer seen as an immediate danger to herself or others. And that brings us, unfortunately, to the date of March 25th, 2000. If we could only hop into a time machine in these stories and go back to these horrible days we talk about, and make a small change here and there, maybe the outcome would be different, if only. The morning of March 25th, 2000, Judy awoke feeling particularly awful. Like I said before, her life was spiraling out of control, and she particularly felt that spiral on that awful Saturday morning. And here is the timeline of that day. At 9:30 a.m., Judy woke up and had the breakfast of champions, drinking wine and downing pain pills. It was reported that Judy then made a few angry phone calls to family members and to her ex-boyfriend by that point, Tinny Kirby. At 11:30 a.m., Judy begins to drive her 1989 white Pontiac Firebird, probably under the influence of both drugs and alcohol at this point. She is accompanied only by her nephew, Jeremy Young, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. Judy leaves her Southside Indianapolis home, heading for her sister's home in Acton to pick up her own children, Joni Kirby, age 9, Jacob Kirby, age 5, and Jordan Kirby, age 12. It is around noon when Judy arrives at the home of her sister, Jeanette Scott. And from the start, Jeanette is not comfortable with how Judy is acting. She seems more bizarre than normal. But apparently not too bizarre, because shortly thereafterward, both women leave the residence, driving first to a car wash and then to McDonald's for soft drinks. Judy was driving in her own car, but still, Jeanette was worried about Judy's condition, and she decided to follow Judy in her own car. Judy had told her sister that her plan was to go to Toys R Us to buy a birthday present for her nephew, who, again, was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. So Jeanette follows Judy in her own car, thinking that they will meet at the Toys R Us. It was around 2 p.m. when Judy left the McDonald's parking lot with the 4 children in her car, 3 of her own children and her 1 nephew. And after only a few miles down the road, Jeanette watches as Judy's car strangely comes to a complete stop in the roadway. And Jeanette is totally confused by this, and not wanting to block traffic with her car, she goes around Judy's stopped car and she turns around at the first side street available, going back to check on Judy, thinking that perhaps she had car trouble. It was now around 2:30 p.m., and when Jeanette gets back to the place where Judy's car had been stopped, Judy and her car were nowhere to be seen. It seemed as if Judy had purposefully been trying to lose her sister trailing her, and she was successful, and now Judy was gone, and she was totally unaccounted for. It was alleged in court testimony that Judy may have also taken more pain pills at this time as well. The following incidents are sightings of Judy Kirby as it was reported by witnesses in her trial. At around 3 to 3:30 p.m., a man working in his yard sees Judy when she stops her car in front of his house. He reports that Judy just stares at him for a few minutes before leaving. It is not clear why she did this, because this man had no relationship to Judy, and it just may have been a random place for her to stop. At around 3:30 to 4 p.m., Judy is then sighted stopping her car at a stop sign near a second witness's driveway, remaining there for approximately 2 minutes as other cars drove around her. The witness who lived there, named Sarah, approaches Judy's car and asks her if she needs to use her phone. And after Judy indicates that, yes, she does need to use the telephone, Sarah goes back into her house, gets a cordless telephone, and hands it to Judy. Instead of making a call, however, Judy then simply drives away with the phone, which prompts Sarah to call 911. However, after Sarah calls 911, she sees that Judy has returned and that her car is now sitting again in her driveway. So Sarah goes out to the car, retrieves the phone, and then goes back inside her home. Sarah would later give the testimony that she watched as Judy sat in her car in her driveway, staring straight ahead for approximately 5 minutes before driving off. Of course, all of this is very concerning behavior, but more concerning behavior is to come. At 4 p.m., a third group of witnesses report that Judy shows up at a baby shower going on in the clubhouse at a local mobile home park. Their testimony states that Judy and the children enter the clubhouse, where no one recognizes her or knows her, and when they ask who she is, Judy simply states, "I need help." When asked what type of help she needs, she just says, "I need a birthday party." People at the shower think Judy might be looking for another gathering at the park's other clubhouse, and they give directions to her to that location. So after about 15 minutes hanging out at the baby shower, Judy and the children return to her car and leave. From 4:10 to 4:45 p.m., there are no reported sightings as Judy drives 21.5 miles toward the town of Martinsville, Indiana. At 4:45 p.m., Judy is spotted again, arriving at a Speedway gas station on the edge of the town of Martinsville. Store security video shows Judy and the 4 children enter the station, paying for gasoline and candy bars. A gas station employee reports that Judy, who sits in the car for several minutes before going inside to pay, is unable to activate the gas pump, and he has to assist her. Later evidence would show that one of the children paid for the entire amount with a $50 bill that Judy gave them to use. Judy had paid for only $3 worth of gasoline and $6.12 in candy. Shortly before 5 p.m., Judy leaves the gas station, and within a minute, all hell would break loose. Judy then drives her white Pontiac Firebird up an exit ramp onto Indiana State Road 67, driving the wrong way and entering the highway via the exit ramp. And she wasn't just driving hesitantly, appearing lost, appearing as if she didn't know what she was doing. That was not the case. Witnesses would say that Judy Kirby accelerated, speeding up as she drove the wrong way on the exit ramp. State Road 67 in Martinsville, Indiana is a divided 4-lane highway. It is a busy road, and as Judy entered the highway from the exit ramp, she was fully driving the wrong way along the highway. She was driving in the wrong direction towards the oncoming traffic. She was traveling northbound in the southbound lanes of the highway, and she was showing no signs of stopping. And within the next minute and a half, multiple lives would be changed forever. Witnesses would later report that Judy's white Firebird did not slow down or falter as she drove the wrong way along the highway. She did not veer off. She did not try to avoid oncoming traffic. In fact, she was accelerating. She was going faster, reaching upwards of 100 miles per hour as her car careened down the 2 southbound lanes. 9 motorists traveling towards Judy's car had to take evasive action, driving away from the lane in which Judy was speeding in order to avoid a collision with her car. One motorist had pressed down and blared her horn to get Judy's attention. But not Judy. She didn't slow down, she didn't stop, she didn't swerve away, she didn't even look. Judy had passed 6 wrong-way traffic signs and 10 do not enter signs, which were all posted along the roadway and very visible to traffic. She knew what she was doing. Judy would have been able to get off the road if she had wanted to. There was an emergency lane available for getting out of the way of the oncoming traffic, and She passed 4 possible turnoffs as she traveled down the road for a minute and a half. Instead, she barreled down the road, staring straight ahead, spanning a distance of 2.5 miles in 1.5 minutes of time. And in her wake, the multiple vehicles that she narrowly missed spun out, crashed into each other, and careened down the road into ditches. The injuries from those accidents, these secondary accidents, the ones that weren't even involved directly with Judy's car, were severe. One EMT would offer this testimony during the trial. We had injuries, broken legs, fractured ribs, bones, cuts, scrapes. We had 2 people who were knocked unconscious after their vehicle hit a drainage ditch and then a telephone pole. It was endless. For 2.5 miles, cars were on both sides of the freeway. While all this was happening, multiple calls came into 911 dispatch, reporting a white car driving in the wrong direction on State Road 67. They said the car was driving at a high speed and not showing any signs of slowing down or moving out of the way. One witness describing Judy's car reported seeing, quote, a small boy in the front seat who looked to be on his knees, his hands outstretched to the dash as if he was holding on, and the driver's blonde hair blowing in the wind. It is an eerie thing to consider this image. It is horrifying. The prosecution would later put it like this. She had nerves of steel, he said. Imagine that for 87 seconds. Cars coming at you, swerving, trying to get you to stop. 9 vehicles. Knowing they all can't avoid her, she just goes faster and faster, and she nails it. And eventually, Judy meets a vehicle which could not avoid her. At approximately 4:57 p.m., Judy's car clips the back of another car and collides headfirst with a van, causing that van to vault into the air and then land on its side. Judy's white Firebird was traveling over 90 miles per hour when it struck the van, and a later investigation of her car indicated that her brake lights were not on at the time of the impact. She had not even put her foot on the brake. The result of that head-on crash was that, in effect, the van was split in half. In fact, both vehicles had completely shattered. The collision, described by witnesses as a horrific, spectacular explosion, was so terrible that emergency personnel would later say that they had been so traumatized by the scene and its twisted wreckage that they would have nightmares for years to come. Judy's car had finally been stopped. Her path of destruction had come to an end. But the destruction was breathtaking. The van which Judy had crashed into was driven by Thomas Reel, age 40, of Martinsville. With him in the van were his 2 children, Bradley Reel, age 13, and Jessica Reel, age 14. Also in the van was another passenger, a friend of the family named Richard, also age 13. Thomas and the 3 children had been at a youth event at their church, and they were on their way home. Thomas and his son Bradley were both killed upon impact. Jessica survived the crash, but died within a few hours while the police and emergency personnel struggled to safely extricate her from the crushed van. She died while still in the wreckage. The other 13-year-old passenger survived and was taken to a nearby hospital. He suffered permanent impairment of his back and foot. Thomas M. Reel, age 40, was also known as Tommy. He was a truck driver for R.L. Carter Trucking, based in Clayton, Indiana. He was also the co-founder of Seedline Christian Ministries, a Bible printing and distribution mission. Thomas was survived by his wife Louise and another daughter, Christine, age 11. Bradley Michael Reel, age 13, was an 8th grade student at Tabernacle Christian School in Martinsville, where he participated in basketball and choir. Jessica Marie Reel, age 14, was a 9th grade student at the same school, Tabernacle Christian School in Martinsville, where she was a cheerleader. Judy's Firebird had also been crushed, and by looking at her car, it's hard to imagine that anyone could have survived the wreckage. And indeed, all 4 children traveling that day with Judy had died upon impact. Judy's 3 children and her nephew were all dead. Jacob Royce Kirby, age 5, was going to start kindergarten later that fall. He loved Chuck E. Cheese, fishing, Nintendo, and playing outdoors. Joni Darlene Kirby, age 9, was a beautiful girl and loved to play with her brothers and sisters. Jordan Thomas Kirby, age 12, was a 6th grader at Frederick Douglass Middle School in Indianapolis. His hobbies included fishing, roller skating, and basketball. Judy's nephew, Jeremy Young, age 10, was celebrating his birthday that day. He was the child of Judy Kirby's sister, Linda Walker, and was being raised by Judy. He was a 4th grade student. The Pontiac Firebird did have one survivor. Judy Kirby had survived the crash. She had been thrown from the car and had a closed head injury and various orthopedic injuries. Her condition was listed as serious as she recovered in the hospital. But Judy wouldn't go home after her hospital stay. The police were there waiting to arrest her, and Judy was charged with 7 counts of murder, 4 felony counts of child neglect, causing serious... But Judy wouldn't go home after her hospital stay. The police were there waiting to arrest her, and Judy was charged with 7 counts of murder, 4 felony counts of child neglect, causing serious bodily injury, and 1 count of aggravated battery. The only question was, would a jury come to the conclusion that the car crash that killed 7 people was intentional or an accident? Had Judy Kirby tried to kill herself and the passengers in her car, or was she not aware of what she was doing? The trial began on April 23, 2001, over a year after the fatal car crash had occurred. The prosecution alleged that Judy intentionally drove the wrong way on the highway, planning to crash her car, kill herself and everyone in the car with her. They alleged that Judy had multiple reasons that contributed to her state of mind before she committed the crime. Number 1, she was angry about being rejected by her boyfriend. Number 2, she was afraid of going to prison for drug trafficking. And number 3, she thought she would be losing custody of her children because of the impending drug charges. The prosecutor called it a suicide mission, saying that she made a conscious decision to drive her car into the oncoming traffic with both hands on the wheel and the screaming children all around her. To support this claim, Judy's ex-husband testified that on one of the days leading up to the crash, Judy had told one of her older sons that she was going to commit suicide. He further testified that he had not been aware of that fact prior to the car crash. On the other side, however, Judy's defense lawyers alleged that Judy's strange behavior on the afternoon leading up to the crash was the result of a thyroid disorder. They said she was mentally ill and that she was losing touch with reality. They said that she did not intentionally crash her car. They said that Judy had been misdiagnosed and improperly treated by medical professionals. They presented Judy as a loving mother who simply lost control of her car in the throes of paranoid psychosis. In addition, the defense played a recording of Judy at the hospital after the crash, saying, "I want to know why. I love my babies. I wouldn't do nothing to hurt my babies. I swear to God in heaven I wouldn't. I wouldn't. I swear to God that's all I love. I wouldn't do nothing to hurt my babies. None of my babies." The jurors were not buying it, however. During the trial, the jurors were taken to the site of the crash. There, along the highway, a memorial had already been placed, marking the spot where 7 lives had been taken. Judy Kirby herself sat quietly during the trial, just looking and listening to all the horrific testimony, and she did not take the stand in her own defense. In his summation at the end of the trial, the prosecutor stood in the middle of the courtroom and allowed 87 seconds to silently and slowly tick by. He told the jury that it was the same length of time that Judy had sped recklessly and dangerously along the highway on the wrong side of the road. 87 seconds. 87 seconds. It was the same length of time during which 7 lives were lost and countless other lives were forever altered. Judy Kirby's trial lasted 12 days. 114 witnesses were called. In the end, the jury deliberated for 10 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all 7 counts. And on June 13, 2001, Judy Kirby was sentenced to 215 years. It was the maximum sentence allowable by law. Of course, the story doesn't end there. Judy Kirby didn't toddle off to prison, head hung low, never to be heard from again. We wish. Why doesn't that happen? Why can't that happen? It never happens. Judy appealed her conviction. Of course she did. And let's go through that part of the story. As I mentioned in my last video, in the story of the evil, disgusting stepfather Gregory Graff, it angers me so much. I always wonder, why put the families through the pain of the appeal process when it is plain as day that the killer is guilty and has been given the exact correct verdict? I don't know. But the legal system has these checks and balances in place for good reasons, so even killers like Judy Kirby can take advantage of what is available to them. Judy's first appeal was in 2002. She was represented by the same lawyers as in her criminal murder trial. The lawyers alleged that the evidence presented about Judy's drug activity should not have been allowed because it had nothing to do with the car crash. They also alleged that the prosecutor had made remarks during the trial which might have been seen to be casting a negative light on the fact that Judy had chosen not to take the stand in her own defense. They alleged that the court had not given a proper circumstantial evidence instruction to the jury either. Further, they argued that the court should not have been allowed 2 police officers who were both state's witnesses to remain in court at the same time, hearing each other's testimony. But those arguments were not successful, and the Indiana Court of Appeals affirmed and upheld the conviction of Judy Kirby. The appeals, though, did not stop there. Judy's second appeal attempt in 2003 was completely refused by the Indiana Supreme Court, but her third appeal attempt did get some traction. In October 2014, 14 years after the fatal car crash, Judy Kirby returned to Morgan County, Indiana, and walked into the same courtroom from her criminal trial, facing the same judge who convicted her to a 215-year prison sentence. And she asked for a new trial. This time, Judy had new lawyers. Her argument this time around was that her criminal trial lawyers were ineffective. She also alleged misconduct by prosecution and the judge, saying that they made legal errors which violated her constitutional rights. They alleged that the mistakes had tainted the jury's decision, and they argued that Judy's former lawyers had failed to object to former bad acts being introduced in her trial, such as her alleged involvement in dealing drugs. The burden of proof in the appeal request rested upon Judy's attorneys. They had to prove both that mistakes were made and that they were significant enough to likely result in a different verdict. Martinsville, Indiana residents were shocked to hear that Judy Kirby had filed an appeal, and they voiced that on the local TV news station. Thomas Reel's widow, Louise, had remarried in the 14 years since the fatal crash that took the lives of her husband Thomas and her 2 children. Louise was committed to be present in the courtroom for Judy's appeal hearing, to not only stand up for herself, but for all the victims. She stated that she had faith that truth and justice would prevail. She said, "That was overwhelming to see her again. When I saw her, it was like I was seeing the same person. There was no change, no remorse, no sadness, no nothing. It was the same person with her head down and with that solemn look on her." Louise said that the news of Judy asking for a new trial had brought back pain from an old wound that had yet to heal. She said, "You move on, but you never forget. And now here she is again, peeling that Band-Aid off and here's this big old scab. I can't believe this is happening again. Louise's youngest daughter with Real, Christine, struggled while growing up because of the loss of her brother and sister. She was only 10 when her siblings died. And Christine, now 25, saw Judy for the very first time when she attended the appeal hearing with her mother. 5 months later, in March 2015, the Morgan County judge rejected Judy's request for a new trial. Judy would be ordered to continue serving her sentence of 215 years. Thomas Real's widow, Louise, had this to say. Waiting was hard, wondering what was going on, how I would handle it if she did get a new trial, how my life once again would be turned upside down and it would revolve around her again, wanting to be free for an act that she knows she committed. People were wishing me the best and saying, "We're behind you, we won't let her get out," Louise said. Judy had one more appeal attempt left, and in her fourth appeal attempt in 2016, her lawyers brought her case to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court justices declined to hear her case. Judy Kirby resides in Indiana Women's Prison, where she is allowed to keep photos of her children, including those whom she killed, with her in prison. I would imagine that Judy's victims and all the people that she affected on that fateful day in March 2000 hope that she lives a solitary life, living alone in prison.
Woman serving a 215-year sentence for a crash that killed 7 people wants a new trial. Judy Kirby will return to court tomorrow in Morgan County more than 14 years after a deadly wrong-way crash on State Road 67. Prosecutors claimed that Kirby intentionally drove north in the southbound lanes right into the path of another family's van. The wreck killed her 3 children and a nephew in her car, plus the driver and 2 more children in the van.
Judy Kirby's attorneys claim her previous lawyers were ineffective. They allege misconduct by prosecutors and the trial judge. Serious legal errors, they say, violated Kirby's constitutional rights.
Come in here this morning and said something about Kirby wants a new trial, and they go, "What?" I said, "Kirby wants a new trial."
Ann Langford says the appeal is opening old wounds in a community that 14 years later is still healing.
You didn't have to say anything. You did not have to explain to them what was Kirby and what did Kirby do. No, she did something that was unforgivable.
In the almost 14 years since then, this is the first time Louise Real Casari has seen the woman who killed her husband Thomas and teenage children Bradley and Jessica.
There's just no accountability, and people think when they do something wrong, they can get away with it, or we can find a loophole for you to get away with it.
Louise remarried. She has a daughter, grandchildren, and an unwavering commitment.
It's a bigger picture than just me. It's all the victims. That you need to stay in there, you need to fight, you don't need to give up. You need to just hang in there, and truth will prevail, and justice will prevail.
Thank you so much for your time and watching this video. I know your time is valuable, and I'm glad you chose to spend some of it listening to this story. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. And if you've made it to the end of this video and you're still watching, I appreciate you even more. If you're still here, please throw some black and red hearts into the comments below in honor of the murder victims in today's story. If you would like to hear more true crime cases from me, please consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. And may the memory of the victims of this fatal car crash be a blessing to all those who loved and cared for them. Until next time, everyone, please take care. See you next time. Bye.